Savannah, Georgia, New Year's Eve, 1859. The river sending a gray breath through Bay Street, while the squares kept their lamps like low stars, and frost filmed the fence rails so that each picket wore a pale edge. In the quarter yard behind the carriage house, the forge held its afterglow. No flame, only a heart of color, enough to warm iron to a thought, not a shout. Ezekiel stood where cinders made a black garden underfoot and weighed his hammer in his palm, the head smudged by years of soot, the handle glossed where hand had taught wood to remember service. The weight did not argue. It answered, steady as bread set on a table, solemn as a blessing said without flourish. Before we go on, please tell us where you are watching from and what time it is for you right now. Beyond the smithy's door, the house conducted itself with the confidence of habit. In the counting room, a lamp drew a thin seam under the threshold, and within that seam lay the breath of paste and calfskin, the odor of ledgers that asked to be believed before they were read. White shirts on pegs in the harness room stared into the forge light. Garments paused between wash and wear, their stiffness like rules left standing while men slept. Doors cleared their throats or refused to. Latches preferred to be struck. Hinges groused where grease had not been spared. Ezekiel listened as a smith must listen, to small scolds, to metal's mood, to air's narrow road. He set the hammer's face to his wrist to test the night's bite, then turned it so the peen rested against his lifeline, the curve fitting the hollow as if the tool had learned the shape of him. The bell from Independent Presbyterian gave one clean phrase, iron certain over brick and live oak. Other bells answered in the squares, like kin trading the hour house to house. He stepped inside the forge and shut the door to a courtesy, not tight, not loud, and the latch took its keeper with a temperate kiss that told him it still wanted teaching. Coal scent, iron scale, the faint sweetness of spent oak. He drew those into his chest and let them hang there, not as smoke, but as instruction. Measure, not fever, bends a bar. Measure, not noise, wins a day. He blew across the anvil face and felt grit move like a small wether, then laid his thumb to the hammer's neck and pressed until the hickory gave back a whisper through bone. Ready. Names arranged themselves behind his ribs, Dinah first, then others gathered by work and kindness, and he counted them without speaking, the liturgy a man keeps in the dark when no witness would honor the saying. He walked the forge's square, palm at times to wall or jamb, reading the building's sentences with his hand. Where cold gathered, where draught liked to travel, where a hinge might be persuaded to courtesy by dawn. The counting room's lamp seam narrowed and widened as if it breathed. He watched its rhythm to keep time by something other than his own want. On the peg, bored a single white apron, clean, unused, waited for a morning that would not own it. Its pallor was not the quarrel, he told himself, the use made of it was. He lifted the hammer one last time and let it find the angle where his wrist would not tire. He did not rehearse a blow. He rehearsed patience, the distance from shoulder to knuckle, the breath that steadies what must be exact, the pause that lets a door remember kindness before a hand asks passage. Outside, the square's bells set another measure along the oaks, and the river answered by moving as it always moves, keeping no man's calendar. Night laid a thin frost along the plantation road, each blade of ditch grass rimmed with a pale edge, while in Savannah's squares a softer warmth gathered, windows breathing punch-sweet air, a fiddler testing strings behind a half-latched door. Johnson Square took the glow like a shallow bowl, and rockets, modest as parish candles, winked without blare above live oaks. In the big house dining room, whale oil flames held steady in their chimneys, and white cloth, smooth as a rule, ran the length of the table with no wrinkle daring to rise. Knives stood in disciplined ranks, goblets kept their crystal hush, and the mantel clock braided seconds into a genteel seam. Down the lane, cabins kept their shoulders close, smoke thin as thread lifting from stick chimneys, the smell of ash and corn mash mingling in a draught that found the yard and went on. Hinges there spoke an older tongue, iron clearing a tired throat, while latches learned, slowly, the milder rise Ezekiel had taught in the service corridor. Children were gathered from stoops before the cold chose their bones. A pot sat to one side on banked coals, not begging, only saying enough, and no more. The bell at Independent Presbyterian counted the hour into both worlds at once, a measured iron that gilded fine china in one room and steadied calloused hands in another. Ezekiel moved between climates without changing his name. In the smithy, coal sent up the clean bitterness that rides iron's scale. When the forge brick exhaled its warmth, it did so like a duty remembered, not a boast. In the parlor vestibule, citrus peel and beeswax made a brighter weather, a comfort that mistook polish for mercy. He noted how doors behaved in each air, the dining room threshold, proud and exacting, the pantry hinge, chastened by grease, the rear entry, where a near shut welcomed a modest stream that would later be asked to do careful work. Whiteness oversaw feast in one chamber. In the harness room, shirts on pegs waited to be claimed by backs that had earned them but would never own them. Laughter rang from town in small, tinny bursts, shop bells tattling arrivals, while the quarters kept their talk low. Names shared like embers cupped against the palm. Dinah among them, held without display. Ezekiel paused at the dining room sill, reading Heat's path as a blacksmith reads a bar, where it swelled, where it fell away, then turned to the yard where frost wrote its own script on the pump handle. Time walked on two sets of feet, the house's clock with its gentle tick and the distant bell that marked the larger road. Between sanctioned glow and thin blue breath he stitched his steps, learning again which hinge would yield, which cloth would bear witness, and which ledger in the counting room would soon be asked to remember it was made of plant and paste before it pretended to speak for men. Late afternoon leaned against Savannah with a damp sleeve, and the loft above the harness room held a cooler breath that smelled of saddle soap, oiled leather, and hay cut months ago. Light slipped through the slats in narrow bands, laying pale ladders across the floor, and dust turned each rung into a quiet constellation. There Ezekiel had once spoken low to the mistress and the preacher, his hat in his hands, his voice trimmed of any edge, as if careful grammar could fence harm. Perfect shoes on the master's bays, he promised, no lame stock in the new year, plowshares ground to sing. In return, one line unwritten. Dinah's name kept off any paper that traveled to the docks. The preacher patted his Bible as if the cover were a seal, offered a soft that impersonated witness. The mistress nodded without looking, as though agreement were a task to be finished before tea. The boards held the shape of that bargain, the way wood remembers weight. Down in the counting room, the figure that should have been crossed out lay sleeping with its kin, and the study kept a well-fed silence that smelled of paste and calfskin. Ezekiel had left that loft, straight-backed and careful, not fooled by kindness, but willing to let a small promise live long enough to prove itself. Bells from the squares spoke evening in patient intervals, and he counted them like notches on the edge of will. New Year's hiring day rose on the river with ropes slapping pilings and gulls arguing over their own hunger. At the docks, men in coats carried lists folded to the crease. A clerk licked a pencil and found a mouthful of wood dust acceptable. Tickets, narrow slips, were tied or pinned, sleeves learning the feel of paper that would never warm to skin. Contracts thickened on tables as if they had grown there from river silt. By noon, the sound of names had thinned to numbers under the shade of the cotton sheds. By dusk, even numbers had the taste of coin. He did not go to the wharf. The smithy kept him to the anvil and breathed its honest ash into his shirt. News travels without shoes. A stable boy returned with river on his boots. Old Bram the teamster spat into the yard and did not meet any eyes. The cook's girl, sent for molasses, came back with a mouth held so tight the sugar could not sweeten it. Dinah let downriver for cash, someone said, let, as if mercy had opened a gate. Fever, quick, hard, no ceremony, finished what paper had started. He walked the service. Corridor once, no aim but movement. There, by the wall where the plaster had learned to hold house smell, a single ribbon lay, a narrow white strip meant for a cap or cuff, fallen without any owner to scold it. It had kept a crease, though stepped on, and took the last light as if remembering the laundress's hand. He picked it up and felt the wrongness in its smoothness. White was not sin. The use men made of it was. The ribbon's clean edge did what no oath had managed. It branded the vow into the meat behind his ribs without leaving a mark any eye could see. He set the ribbon on the loft's beam, where river air might roughen it, and went back to the forge. The hammer waited, not hungry, only sure of itself. He pressed the face of it gently to the anvil, and listened to the mild contact, the note that promises work, not theater. Names gathered and stood in order, Dinah first, and he let them take their places as a congregation takes pews when the bell calls. Somewhere a door closed with the old arrogance. Somewhere else a latch he had disciplined chose courtesy. Ledgers downstairs breathed in, shallow practiced measure. Upstairs, a single strip of white learned to be something other than a tag. He fed the coals until they answered with an even hum, then turned from the fire's mouth with his palm cooled, the vow settled, and the night's next breath prepared to do its counting. Night cooled the forge to a deep, steady ember, and the yard beyond lay crisp under a sky rinsed clean by river air. Ezekiel set the door on a respectful catch so the room could breathe in a narrow stream, then crossed to the rack where handles waited like plain oaths. He chose hickory by touch, not glance, grain running true, no knot to lie under the palm, and seated the haft to the soot-dark head with a turn that asked patience from wood and iron, both. The fit spoke without clatter, a quiet assent, and he lifted the tool to listen through his wrist. The weight answered him with a calm that did not borrow from rage. He made no flourish toward the anvil. Instead, he worked the haft along his grip, mapping each inch of smoothness and slight rise, learning where the handle would ask for more skin or less. The hammer, once the emblem of break, became in his keeping a level, a keeper of line, not a blow, but a balance. He touched the peen to the anvil face lightly, just enough to hear the well-mannered note, and stored that pitch beside the bell's more distant measure so both could govern his hour. On the bench a tobacco tin kept counsel. He eased its lid and slipped inside a narrow offcut, torn from a dead account, paper that had traded men for sums and would now serve to hush a hinge. Beside it he folded a strip of clean rag, thinning the layers with his thumb until it lay like a small bed, meant to teach a wick to take only what it needed. He did not name the fire he might borrow later. He taught himself the modesty of breath and ember, not flare. He moved through the service passage with a smith's ear tuned to wood. The pantry hinge sulked as before. He answered with a whisper of tallow and a finger's rub, then opened and closed the door until iron agreed to lay down its temper. At the counting-room threshold he found the loose flagstone again, its edge riding a hair high, and marked it in his body, not chalk, a half-step to the left that would carry him without sound. In the kitchen entry he set the door to almost no more than a coin's width, watching the draught discover that gap and choose it every time like water faithful to its fall. He returned to the forge and set the hammer, half down, to lean along the jamb where it could lend its weight to wood when wood would be asked to refuse pride. Under his hand the tool steadied the frame without bruise, a shoulder rather than a fist. The tin went under the loose plank near the hall, the bed prepared, the muffle ready, the paper given its better task, and he pressed the board back until it lay flush and unremarked, as if the floor had always been so well behaved. Names gathered in him again, not for grief this time, but for order. Each a bead slipped onto a cord that would not tangle. Dinah, then the elders who had taught him measures, then the young whose steps he kept careful in the lanes. He crossed the yard once more, reading the hinge he had disciplined, and the latch he had tutored, and let the bell's distant phrase fix the count in his bones. The hammer wrote his palm like a plum now, truer than anger, its silence the better sound. When he shut the forge to a patient near close, the door settled in its keeper without complaint, and the room, newly taught, held its breath at a steady pace, ready to keep company with whatever work asked to be done. Night gathered its edges, but did not close, and the service corridor held a breath that moved from stove-warm to cool stone in the span of a doorway. Ezekiel slipped from the forge's dusk into that narrow passage where plaster kept the day's heat like a faint memory, and the flagstones learned patience underfoot. He pressed his palm to the rear latch, lifted with a care the metal now understood, and felt the tongue clear its keeper without complaint, the hinge answering in a tempered murmur that said its old quarrel was done. He measured distance by lungs rather than paces. A slow draw to the hearth's dark mouth, another to the scarred work-table where knife marks wrote a plain scripture, a last measured exhale to the pantry's leaf that yesterday rasped, but tonight only breathed. He set a finger to the hinge's knuckle, tallow having tutored it earlier, and it yielded with the manners of metal, corrected without humiliation. A board on the stair announced itself with a shy groan. He leaned a thumb to the banister's post and shifted his weight an inch left, storing the better line of travel in muscle, not chalk or mind. At the counting-room door, he felt along the jamb until the weak seam of air licked the back of his hand, the draft that crept floorward like a rumor. From his pocket he took the little tobacco tin and slid it beneath a loosened plank by the hall, a small cache with a clean rag and a sliver of paper folded to silence any telltale chatter, then pressed the board down until it lay true. He traced a soft X with a nub of soapstone where the baseboard met the counting-room threshold. No flourish, a timid sign set low enough that only his kneeling eyes would find it when the hour asked. The house's clocks kept separate jurisdictions, the mantel's tidy tick, stitching seconds together, and farther off, a bell that laced the night with longer strands. He twined the two in his chest and let their braided measure govern the next breath. At the sideboard in the parlor's shadow, he touched a cup rim and left it facing water rather than wine, not to punish, only to persuade a throat to simpler speech when sermon sought a smoother oil. In passing, he put his thumb to the kitchen door and set it to nearly a narrow welcome that would draw air like a thread instead of a rope. He did not unfold the slip of names he kept near his heart. His fingers knew each crease, the way a reader knows a psalm by its cadence, not the print. Dinah's syllables steadied first, then the elders who had taught him the honest grammar of wood and heat, then the children whose light steps he kept in mind when doors must not startle. He returned to the yard for one breath of river cool and re-entered the scullery where soap, smoke, and a small clean resin from the handle rack made a modest weather fit for purpose. The latch lifted once more. Up, hold, down. And the door took its seat without fuss. Somewhere a beam sighed, a hinge remembered kindness, and the forge, far back, held its ember like a kept promise, while Ezekiel stood in the narrow light and felt the night cinch to exactness, ready to bear what must be carried. Cold drew a bright edge along the anvil's horn, and the yard held its quiet, as if cupped by the low roofs, the sky salted with shy stars. Ezekiel sat on the stump by the forge door where cinders had settled into a dark shore, the hammer laid across his thigh, not as threat, but as measure, its head turned so the peen rested like a calm moon above his knee. He let the tool's weight find his bone, then eased his breath until the rise met the fall and stayed there, steady as a level held to timber. Far off, bells in the squares practiced a phrase, and let it go. Between those notes he counted what must be kept and what must be released. On the workbench a tobacco tin waited, lid dulled to a small, honest sheen. Inside, a folded rag lay patient beside a narrow strip torn from spent paper, both kept not for show but for their quiet offices. He lifted the tin, listened for any tattling rattle, and heard none. The care he had taken earlier held. The forge, banked to a ruddy thought, did not speak flame, only breathed a yea temperate warmth that stroked the palm without claiming it. Coal's bitter sweetness threaded the air with iron and oak, and the smell steadied the mind the way a psalm steadies a room when the preacher runs long. He drew from his pocket the slip of names and pressed it to his chest through his shirt, not opening, not peering, letting corners learn the cadence of his ribs. He said them inwardly, each syllable set down like a tool returned to its peg at day's ending. Dinah foremost, then the elders whose hands had taught him exactness, then the young who walked the lanes soft-footed, trusting doors to mind themselves. He did not hurry the list, nor ornament it. Voice would have made a display of what was better born as breath. The litany, kept in the sternum's cupboard, became a slow rope drawn hand over hand, drawing him to the hour that would require him whole. From the lane came small tidings, a pail set down with care, a child turned in sleep, a hinge, one he'd schooled, choosing courtesy. Ezekiel lifted the hammer, kissed the cold iron once at the edge where face meets neck, and set the head lightly to the anvil's skin. The touch made no ring, only a felt contact, the agreement two honest surfaces make when asked to share weight without harm. He struck flint once and let the spark go unfed, small brilliance dying on purpose, readiness, not flourish, claimed the night. He rose, easing the hammer under his arm so metal would not gossip against stone, and set the tin into his apron pocket, where it kept its counsel. He read the yard by touch, the damp seam along the trough's rim, the bench's worn lip that remembered backs, the peg where line hung with its own good gravity, and felt the river's cool lift the hair at his wrist. The bell at Independent Presbyterian tolled 10 with a round, exact tone that came gentle as a hand to his crown. 11 followed as a measured pair walking the same road at different strides, and between them the world clarified. The corridor's new discretion, the kitchen door's narrow welcome, the counting room's low breath behind wood. He took the slip of names once more, put his mouth to the paper without opening it, and returned it to its place. Then he walked the little path between forge and gallery stair, the night-making room rather than parting, the boards accepting his footfall as if they had awaited the wait. He did not look back. The anvil kept its bright edge, the embers husbanded their quiet strength, and the bells, satisfied for the moment, gave him the hour without demand. He passed through the service door that had learned respect and let it fall into its keeper without quarrel, the metal's mild assent giving him the last permission he required. Midnight pressed a cool brow to the counting-room window, and inside the lamplight made a quiet province of brass, paper, and breath. Heat idled low in the grate, not enough to boast, enough to loosen stiffness in calfskin and paste. The air along the baseboard crept with a small intention toward the desk where figures slept in columns. The master bent over those ranks with a hum he likely mistook for piety, pen moving in a measured scrape that sounded like approval teaching itself. On a side table, the seal waited with its jaw shut, a patient curb. Ezekiel entered with a coal scuttle cradled in both hands. His steps kept to the room's temper. Threshold, 2 soft boards, a turn that spared the bright nick in the fender. Earlier he had taught this floor to forget its favorite protest. Now it accepted his weight as if it had always been courteous. He knelt at the hearth and set a hollowed shaving of pine to cradle one ember, the shy coal he coaxed with tongs, its heart the color of ripe persimmon, set down not as spark, but as tutor. Resin breathed a sweetness without smoke, the kind that persuades rather than demands. He drew from his apron the little tin and rested it in his shadow while the master's pen made thin weather. The lid, muted by the folded ledger scrap fitted under its lip in a previous hour, gave no metal whisper as it opened to confirm the rag's patient bed. He slid the tin shut again and kept its counsel, then eased a wick beneath the grate's lip where the draught he had measured, door near shut to a coin's width, would find it. The stop wedged the jamb to almost, neither sealed nor brash. The room began to breathe in narrow, regular sips like a careful sleeper. Corners of one ledger page relaxed their discipline. Not a curl that begged attention, only a softening at the edges, as if the paper remembered being plant before it was law. Ezekiel squared the topmost book with 2 fingers, not to show service, but to feel the tooth in the margin where a damp thumb had once paused. Warmth coaxed that shadow to show itself, a pale tide mark stepping forward from meekness. Names trapped in arithmetic made assent when they could not speak. Paste tipping toward sugar, sugar toward faint scorch, an unboastful sermon the master's nostrils did not know how to read. "Mind the fire," the master said, not looking, and Ezekiel inclined as though to obey, while he merely turned the hollowed split a finger's width so that ember spoke to wick without audience. No flare, no smoke to write on walls, only a disciplined glow that walked along twine in a slow education. The lamp's chimney across the room fogged and cleared as if glass had taken up a human habit. The seal gleamed with a dog's patience, all restraint and no bark. He pinched the doorstop finer by a hair. The draught answered in gratitude, the way a creek answers a stone removed from its throat. The wick's light deepened under the grate where no eye wandered, and warmth made new grammar along the desk. Columns that had stood like drilled men eased their chests. A ribbon marker slackened, humbled. The pen faltered, then made a blot shaped like a small eclipse. The master shook sand with a tidy. Man's annoyance and watched grit absorb disobedience without effect. Ezekiel's hand rested to the door and felt the room's lung pick up his fingers, pass between them, and go on to its work. He held it account, then let it alone. Behind him, a ledger corner lifted and lay down as a mother corrects a child without scolding. The man at the desk cleared his throat to remind the world he was right. Midnight's bell from the square spoke once through shutter slats, the tone slipping along molding and chairback before it came to settle against the book's spines like a palm. The scuttle shut with proper modesty, and Ezekiel rose, carrying nothing of flame. He left arrangement, not fire. The near-shut door made room for him, and then resumed its lesson without creak. In the corridor, cooler air kept counsel along plaster and stair, and hinges he had schooled made no boast. Behind him, numbers learned humility under warmth that did not scorch, and a draught that did not swagger. Paper remembered it had roots, and the seal, waiting for its summons, found none. He did not look back. The room had begun to tell itself another story, one in which ledgers took the part of breath instead of verdict, and the night received that revision without raising its voice. Near midnight, the pantry corridor kept a cool hush. Flour sifted thin across the flagstones so that steps wrote pale lines and then forgot them. A lantern on a wall hook burned low and tight. Its light gathered into a small, obedient circle that did not trespass. The air moved with purpose along the baseboard, a measured stream tutored earlier to mind its path. It slid past a latch that had learned modesty and into the seam beneath a door that liked to think itself important. At the corridor's bend, a boy with a flour sack apron gripped a basket to his ribs, gaze pinned to the back kitchen door as though attention alone could coax iron to kindness. From the scullery turn, Ezekiel stepped into that slim weather, shoulders turned a fraction to narrow his passage, the hammer tucked under his arm so metal would not gossip against stone. He read the latch's posture, no longer a braggart, not yet a friend, and set 2 fingertips beneath its tongue, lifting with the quiet rise he had trained into it earlier in the night. Between thumb and keeper, he slid a folded shred of rag, a scrap retired from wiping iron now promoted to gentling law, and the cloth accepted its new office without complaint. The second overseer's voice came from the rear porch like a switch tested in air, sharp, small-souled, satisfied with its own sound. "You there, back out," he barked, the words learning vanity as they left his mouth. Keys chattered at his belt, a little brass sermon that assumed listeners. The boy's knuckles whitened on the wicker, but he held his ground where the lantern circle touched his toes and waited, as some children do, for doors to choose decency. Ezekiel knelt once, set the E-Ades hammer's head to the base of the panel at a quiet angle, and let the haft lean as a shoulder leans when a friend must pass and a prideful body must stop. No flash, no show, only weight translated into manners. Wood took the counsel and held it. The hinge, chastened earlier by tallow and patience, gave a low, respectful turn, metal having learned how to serve without raising its voice. Draft stepped through at once, as if invited, touched the lantern into a lower note, and kept walking. "Now," Ezekiel said to the boy, the word as soft as a mitten, "nothing for men to challenge." The child slid through the space the door made, basket tilted like a skiff finding its current, the white of the apron no longer a tag, but a simple utility in motion. The overseer reached in reflex, his keys snagging on a nailhead that had learned stubbornness from old wood. Metal clicked against grain, and hung there as if a lesson had chosen its pupil. He swore under his breath, thin oath, no courage in it, and tugged at the ring, discovering how easily loudness loses its friends. Ezekiel lifted the rag from the keeper, folded it once for later service, and let the latch return to its seat with a mild consent. He did not look at the man on the porch. He addressed the door with his palm, thanking it for keeping its vow. In the corridor, the flower dust settled, a fine snow finding home. Behind the panel, the boy's step altered from hurried to sure, the small sound of wicker against cloth telling anyone who knew how to listen that a child had found a safe room before the night turned its next page. The overseer's boots scuffed irritation in a narrow circle and then retreated, keys reclaimed with the small vanity of a man who thinks his hand restores order. The lantern breathed once and steadied. Ezekiel eased the hammer from its lean, an inch only, and felt wood keep the temper it had learned. He turned toward the central hall where the clock's thin tick rehearsed propriety, and the stair waited with lessons of angle for a mouthful of scripture. The door stayed a door, the hinge kept courtesy, and the corridor's taut breath flowed on, making a road where rule had stood. The main hall kept a tempered glow, whale oil flames steady in their glass, while the stair rose like a slow river of wood, catching and releasing light in shallow eddies. From the dining room drifted a warm braid of spice and meat. From the upper gallery came a cooler breath gathered along the plaster, and where the two airs met on the turn, they made weather a man ought to respect. The clock behind beveled glass stitched seconds with a needle-fine tick, and its certainty reached the banister the way a hymn reaches pews, quietly, without asking permission. Ezekiel stood one tread below the bend, shoulder in the stair's own shadow, one hand resting upon the rail just above a shallow thinning where polish had worn to honesty. The grain under his palm ran straight as a sober thought. The guiche post took his weight and gave it back without complaint. He had learned this rise by body earlier, where one board preferred to announce itself, where another accepted a careful foot as if tutored in courtesy. Below, doors he had disciplined kept their peace. Above, a single hinge tried a small opinion and then remembered its manners. The preacher stepped from the parlor, voice trimmed smooth, glass in hand, scripture riding his tongue, as if certainty were a saddle. "Uphold the order," he began, the phrase rounded for company rather than truth. He took the first lift with a heel that trusted habit, and Ezekiel felt the tread he had memorized accept that trust and offer back a modest difference. No trap, only a fact in wood. Geometry met rhetoric. The heel hesitated. The rail, honest and patient, received a hurried clutch. No shattering, no flurry. Only a brief surrender of height to balance, a man discovering breath where speech had thought to be king. Wine drew a dark run along the outside of the glass, a thin ribbon that corrected the boast, and the sermon detained itself in the throat, seeking a plainer road. The clock took one deliberate step, and then another, as if agreeing to the edit. Air, finding the turn, placed a cool hand behind the preacher's collar and withdrew, reminder offered, lesson taken. An odd tread, he murmured, attempting to charm the wood with a half-smile, but even his voice had lost some ornament, shaved closer to bone. He set the next foot down with a caution he would not own, toe feeling for truth before the heel committed. Scripture followed, leaner now, trimmed by the angle's insistence. Phrases that had aimed at the rafters met the grain and learned to walk. Ezekiel's thumb pressed once to the rail, a small blessing for the post and for the man who was learning to listen to a staircase. From the square outside, a single bell note entered through the fanlight and rang along the molding, traveling the spine of the house without rattle. The preacher's jaw worked once, swallowed pride with the swallow, and the glass steadied, its surface no longer a mirror for self-regard, but a common drink in a common hand. He gained the landing not as a victor, but as a guest returned to the language of feet. "Take care with the tray," he said to no one, the instruction suddenly sounding like a prayer that had learned its place. Ezekiel slipped back a tread, leaving the turn free for what must pass next. Behind him, the foyer gathered its warmth into a quiet pool. Ahead, the upper corridor waited with doors that had been taught to receive without show. The stair, faithful to its oath, kept lifting those who honored its measure and corrected those who forgot. Sermon, chastened by angle and air, went on in a smaller key. He turned toward the hall where feast and ceremony would soon be asked to share a table with consequence, the rail under his palm returning to its quiet shine as if nothing had happened at all. The front hall kept a Sabbath gleam, whale oil steady in its glass, and the long table wore its whiteness like a verdict that presumed applause. Silver stood in regiments, crystal waited like clear bells without tongues, and beneath the linen the plank remembered trees more than manners. From the service door, set to a narrow grace, a measured breath crossed the boards and made no boast. At the mantel, the clock unspooled seconds in a soft chain that neither flattered nor forgave. Ezekiel moved at the table's lee where chairs gathered their legs like cattle at a rail. He knelt once at the knee-hole and laid his hand against the seam where brace met belly, feeling a shy cool seeping upward from masonry. The cloth above him, taut with starch and certainty, draped to just short of the floor, its hem a pale horizon that believed itself beyond geography. From his apron he brought a thin wick, tame as a shoelace, and a square of lint thinned under his thumbnail. He pinned the twine beneath the table's lip, where no eye fed, set the lint as a quiet bed, and let both learn their stations, as witness, not spectacle. At the far end, the mistress arranged her lace and owned her chair with the serene presumption of weather. Near the door, the overseers made a porch out of posture, boots squared, hands casual on hips to show whose air this was. Guests ringed the room in small companies, voices held in saucers to avoid spills, while beneath all that arrangement the floor's slow breath honored the gap at the kitchen door and the almost close that taught the room to sip. The punch bowl waited at the head, an island of glitter the cloth pretended to hold in place. Ezekiel's hand passed along the linen's underside once, not to wake warmth, only to count the weave and the distance to the master's place. He turned to the mantel lamp and trimmed a stingy ribbon from its wick, a show for those who preferred ceremony to use, and the flame lifted and remembered itself, then settled. Along the paneled wall, a mild eddy began its pilgrimage, a pilgrim with no banner, only patience. Above, the chandelier made a firm argument for light, Below, the draught made no argument at all, choosing the faithful path to the table's hem, and then beneath, where the small bed waited for its education. Conversation set itself to harvest, easy blessings, names offered as currency rather than kin. The mistress lifted a corner of the linen covering the silver basin and let it fall, a gesture rehearsed enough to be habit and not quite honest. Ezekiel, standing at the sideboard with a decanter that needed no polishing, laid a finger beneath the table edge, a benediction rather than a spark, and stepped back. Heat learned its grammar under the cloth, shading the weave where no one looks, teaching a proud whiteness to remember the labor it so often supervised. A guest paused mid-sentence, face touched by a doubt too polite to declare itself. Another lifted a spoon, set it down, and forgot what remark it had meant to chaperone. The overseer near the door tugged his cuff and found his wrist damp. No smoke, no threat, only a slow, disciplinary warmth, writing in a script the cloth had never imagined, an alphabet of consequence. The bowl at the head shivered a reflection, tremor small as a held breath. From the square, the bell sent its first midnight stone into the air, one note stepping through sash and down paneling to sit among knives. With the second, shadow on plate, rims bent inward a hair. With the third, the napery's inner country deepened by a degree, not stain, only a correction. The mistress reached for the bell pull and found its pale rope too slight for the work at hand. Her fingers returned with nothing accomplished. The overseer's talk thinned. The parlor's steady clock refused to change its gait for appetite. Ezekiel eased the service door a sliver, not an inch, and felt the room agree to a better sentence. At the head, the linen over the basin stopped pretending to be cloud and lay down like weather that had learned humility. The master's chair, attended by all the old courtesies, received a small warming from beneath, the sort that takes more certainty from a body than it gives. Ezekiel touched the cloth again, a test for harm finding only discipline, and set a folded napkin on the sideboard with a care that would have honored bread. He took up the decanter and turned toward the corridor where hinges, lately schooled, practiced silence, leaving behind a table dressed for its own absolution and discovering instead that justice can arrive quietly, under a cloth, and ask a room to tell the truth it has long edited. Pre-dawn held the yard in a gentler grip, the ground giving back a faint cool as though it had remembered a promise in the night and kept it. The well stood square and honest by the scullery door, rope quiet over stone. Beyond it, the gallery posts wore a pale damp that would soon turn to day. Ezekiel crossed from the forge path into this calmer weather, shoulders settling as the air shifted from coal's bitter sweetness to the cleaner breath of water and earth. On the bench, the tobacco tin waited with its rubbed lid. Beside it, the coal scuttle rested empty, mouth dark and satisfied. He set the tin on the well's curb and lifted the dipper. The bucket's rise hummed in the rope, a sound deeper than complaint, older than any clock. When he tipped the cup, water slid in one continuous sheet over brass, and the soft hiss that followed spoke completion rather than spectacle, a long-held tension leaving by the appointed road. Metal cooled under his palm until it forgot heat, and he closed the lid without a click, the folded paper in the seam finishing its brief service and becoming only paper again. He placed the hammer to the rack inside the lean-to, half touching haft among hoes and forks, a fellowship of tools that knew their tasks without boasting. The head had not been asked for fury. Tonight it had worked as ballast and reminder, teaching a door to keep its manners and a hand to measure. In the yard's stillness, time kept itself not by bell or clock, but by the thinning of dark along the fence rail, by the way the pecan leaves tested air and found it harmless. Names steadied in his chest, less like sparks and more like coals. Dinah first, then the elders who had taught him exactness, then the children whose steps he had shielded from sudden hinges. He crouched at the scullery step and poured a second cup onto packed earth, a deliberate circle that darkened and then drank inward. The ring it left at the edge resembled a seal pressed into wax, not to bind, but to close a matter with fairness. Ledger lines in the counting room would never reckon such a figure. The ground, being wiser, received it without argument. He set the cooled tin among honest things, a bucket with a new stave, a box of bent nails awaiting second lives, a cracked jar fit to hold seed, and rested his hand on the lid as one might bless bread. The door behind him, lately tutored, lifted and settled itself with courtesy. The house drew a quiet breath and kept it. Ezekiel stood in the narrow light where night and morning meet, and felt the hour cinch to its proper fit. No triumph, no lament, only balance, and let that plain measure pour through him like water sufficient for thirst. Dawn thinned the night to a pale wash along Bay Street, and the road answered with wagon creaks, hoof clatter, and the small clink of bits testing teeth. The courthouse steps kept their cool longer than faces did. Ezekiel stood where the stoop boards held the last of darkness, wrists free, breath plain, the air around him scrubbed of forge scent and hall spice, trimmed now to stone and dust. As the riders came up the lane with the language of warrants on their mouths, doors along the passage behaved as they had been taught. A latch seated without vanity, a hinge withheld complaint, a threshold remembered its charity, even for boots that did not bring it. Cabins opened by inches onto the yard. Eyes made a ledger no book would hold. Old Bram's steady look, a child's cheek pressed flat to his palm to keep from calling, a kerchief's white square lifted once in a window and let fall like breath. No names rose to the open air. They traveled rib to rib as cups travel along a crowded table. Nothing spilled, everything understood. A scrap of cloth on a line in the side yard moved because the river sent up a rumor of wind, not because a tag had claimed it. Whiteness had taken a better service and kept it. Savannah's street bells tattled arrivals in bright little notes, shop doors and shutters yawning into their day, while the city pretended to have no part in fields at all. By noon, heat found stone and kept it. The courthouse hall smelled of ink, dust, and wool. Benches bore people who sat as if Sunday had required them, hands folded small to keep from striking. Any mark the law would read wrong. Papers lay upon the table with their corners frayed and darkened, as though weather had argued with them and won a little. Questions came in tidy rows like fence pickets hammered to plumb. Ezekiel's answers were exact where exactness would not betray, and silent where speech would teach the wrong lesson how to walk. He lifted no chin and dropped none. He let time do its portion of the talking. The clerk's pen, brisk on most points, paused over a blot that had learned to disagree with sand. The judge's fingers settled upon the chair's arm as the noon bell from the square walked in through the fanlight. A measured iron reminding ribs that hours have their own sovereignty. The master's allies arranged their faces as though mercy were a garment lent for the day and due back at dusk. A preacher, ankle-taught last night by angle, kept his foot quiet and his counsel thinner than yesterday. The room listened not to eloquence, but to the lack of it, and in that narrow attention the story found the dignity it had earned. Neither parade nor apology, only weight counted and set down. When the questions ended, the benches breathed in one body, and the heat did not relent. They took Ezekiel back across the portico, where columns pretended to shade and did not quite succeed. The steps spoke cool through his soles, stone telling bone what it tells everyone, reckon fairly, add no blessing. Sun made a hard shine of the street, and cart tracks braided dust into shallow ropes. Behind him, paper waited for the next hand to ask it for more than it had to give. Ahead, the bell's echo left the air and made its home where echoes belong. He walked forward, not bowed and not unbowed, while windows, mouths, and ledgers recalculated according to what a quiet night had already taught the house. Late light leaned through the jail's narrow slit and broke upon limewash like a dulled blade, leaving a pale strip that climbed the wall and then rested. The holding room kept stone's temper, cool that did not comfort, steadiness without favor. The bench beneath Ezekiel bore the polished memory of other backs and offered him the same unornamented truce. Outside, wheels whispered over grit, and a bell somewhere in the city tested one brief note, as if to see whether the hour would answer. His hands lay quiet upon his knees, skin faintly scored where cord had taught redness and then relented. The air arranged itself into honest sounds. Key turned just enough. Shoe slowed where plank met sill. A door corrected by patience, choosing to close without pronouncing judgment. He allowed each to keep its measure and gave none dominion. Within, names took their places as an evening congregation takes pews. Dinah first, then elders who had tutored exactness, then small ones whose steps had been spared the shock of proud hinges. He did not speak them. Attendance is strongest when the heart keeps the roll. Whiteness rose in thought with its old. Arrogance vanished. He saw not cap or cuff, but cloth stretched between cabin posts, shouldering air, accepting weather, washing lifted, not as emblem, but as shelter. A child's shirt small as a sail, brave without knowing it. That same color, once tied to a wrist to make a claim, now served bread and bed, shade and covering. The axe in memory leaned among tools, a good shoulder rather than a bite. Ledgers, chastened by warmth, had fallen quiet. Bells, lately imperious, had learned to keep time for work and rest instead of decree. He tilted his face to the slit and was given a scant wedge of road, a corner of sky, one elm leaf rubbing its own green along iron. It was enough. Where light touched bar, brightness made a rung no foot could mount, then withdrew decently, leaving the wall the color of skimmed milk, a calm the day had not always deserved. He set his shoulders forward until his body made a porch of itself, a place where weather might pass through without taking anything it had not offered. Along the corridor, a lock performed its task and went on, declining spectacle. Doors had been tyrants and were now students. Hinges had been scolds and were now courteous. Such is the grammar of things when asked with steady hands. Somewhere a woman shook a sheet and clapped it once to chase off the last damp. White lifted, agreed to wind, and returned to usefulness. Ezekiel folded his fingers as if cradling a bowl not yet filled, and let the silence settle around him like linen on a line, plain and without charge, while the city outside rehearsed its noise, and the stone beside him kept faith without praise. Late summer loosened the heat along River Street, so that evening could lay its hand upon docks and porches without quarrel. Barrels sweated, ropes slept in loose coils, and the water carried both rumor and reflection without choosing between them. In backlots and field edges past Thunderbolt, voices gathered the way beans climb, by reaching and holding, making a trellis of air for themselves. The tale did not arrive as a march, but as a cadence, traded household to household until the very fences seemed to lean closer. They spoke Ezekiel's work as measure rather than spectacle. The hammer was remembered not as a blade, but as a counterweight that taught wood to keep its promise. Ledgers, once stiff with borrowed virtue, were recalled for the faint sweetness they exhaled when warmed into humility. A white cloth, relieved of its throne, was seen lifting on a wash line between doors, shouldering a breeze the way a back shoulders bread home. Bells, formerly given to command, took up a gentler office, marking when to gather, when to part, when to lay tools down without shame. Doors themselves acquired courtesy. Hinges went from scolds to ushers, and names, spoken softly, were planted like seed where children would find them sprouted. The story changed its gait to fit each stoop. In the quarter lane, an elder told how a counting room forgot its spine and learned to breathe like a man who had worked. At the school shed, a girl chalked her father's name twice so paper would not make it thin. Under a lean-to, a boy swung a door once, felt it settle without insult, and declared that iron could be taught if hands were patient. In fields, noon wind walked the corn like a choir choosing key. By the marsh, someone filled a dulled silver basin with rain for thirsty rows and called it right use. Quilts pieced from cast-offs, stubborn squares of pale cloth among colors, were lifted to the line and by night warmed bodies with no sermon at all. Sorrows were not erased to make room for comfort. They were set chair by chair beneath a live oak where all could see the shape of the table. Verdicts did not mend themselves overnight, yet the tale kept its oath to consequence, not to ease. It reminded listeners that tools can be asked to honor life, that paper can be made to forget its arrogance, that color can be turned from emblem to shelter, that sound can count without commanding, that a threshold can welcome rather than bar, and that names, once damaged, can be handled until they carry their weight again without tearing. By lantern on a stoop, hands spelled new letters onto old wood. By window light, a mother taught a child the lesson of hinges and hush. The river went on doing river's business, and the city, pretending not to hear, altered by increments. A latch greased, a bell rung for planting as well as prayer, a clerk pausing at a blot that refused to be hurried into obedience. When night widened and the telling thinned to murmurs, the circle rose slow to keep what had been made between them. And if this account has found a place at the hearth, return and keep the watch with us. Lay a quiet sign of favor, and set your thought or question in the common book, so the next name may find its way. If this story stayed with you, come back to keep watch with us. Leave a small sign of support, and share your thoughts or questions so the next name can be heard.